I should probably also say, thank you for that brief introduction. I do work at the Institute for Work and Health, where I do research on the health and well-being of workers. That's what my organization does, and we do research kind of on two aspects: how work impacts health and how health impacts work. And so our work is very much focused on different types of jobs, different types of industries, looking at different types of working conditions. And my work is very broad. It spans different types of workers. And so I am hoping that these findings and this research, which isn't focused on care work specifically, but can resonate with you. And I hope that I can also give you some recommendations that you can take back with you and think about as you maybe incorporate some of the things that I mentioned. But that said, I want this interactive component also to be a learning exercise for me so I can learn from you and learn about your experiences in the field, in this industry. Maybe I hope it'll lead to bigger, brighter things where maybe that'll be an opportunity for me to do more focused research on care workers. So I'd love to hear from you. So please do engage. Okay, so I think I've given you enough time and I'm going to get started with my first slide. So physical activity and heart health. So I guess the 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 foundation of my research, one of the main areas of my work, is to understand ways in which we can promote the benefits of physical activity and exercise in working populations. And I'll be talking to you in more detail about this, but it's really because we recognize that something that is so effective, this really effective medicine, this therapy that has its benefits across not only physical health but mental health. It is hard. It's a hard pill to take in that it's not always achievable for many people. Life gets in the way, work gets in the way, and I'll make a case for that. And I want to hear your thoughts as well. And so, because it can be so challenging for so many, what are ways in which we can emphasize or support people in gaining the benefits that come from physical activity so that they can receive this whole host of benefits that we've really understood from many decades of evidence and research. And so what is that? What are those benefits? So just in case you aren't so familiar, when we say you should try to walk more, try to exercise as much as you can, we're really trying to get you to get these benefits of being active. And if you're not active enough, there's a host of evidence that it can lead to a lot of different risks for your overall health and well-being. And so not only can it impact, your ability to um, your metabolic health, so your ability to gain weight. So it's associated with unhealthy weight gain and obesity, but it's also linked to your metabolic system in terms of your heart health, your risk for type 2 diabetes, your risk for other things that are really the building blocks for a risk of cardiovascular disease. And so this is your cholesterol, your blood pressure, and I said with diabetes, your increased risk of blood glucose levels going higher than recommended. And so with that, these are really the health benefits that we recognize from a whole host of research, but we're also learning in the last few decades that there's also benefits to the worker and the workplace. And so there's evidence that if you're healthy, you build your, you're active, you build your overall health by being active as regularly as possible. There's evidence that not only does this benefit worker well-being and your overall physical and mental health, but it also reduces your risk of future injuries and absenteeism for work. Now, it kind of makes sense if you think of, you're really building your resistance, your resilience, your ability to kind of withstand strain and physical effects of work. And so there's that reduced risk of injury if you build your fitness through physical activity. Now, unfortunately, it's not as easy as I mentioned before to meet the guidelines. And what are those guidelines? Well, the World Health Organization will say to you that adults should accumulate a weekly average of 150 to 300 minutes of what we call moderate intensity, or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity physical activity, or a combination of both with some strength training exercises. And what do I mean by moderate or vigorous? It's really activities that get your heart racing, heart pumping, you're sweating. It makes it hard for you to form sentences. And so you're doing all that, you're going for a brisk walk, you're running on the treadmill. And that's really what you want to be doing for 150 to 300 minutes, well, for those benefits of physical activity. And so, unfortunately, the numbers aren't so great in terms of who actually meets those guidelines. And in Canada, and we have a similar estimates to the global estimates, which is that around half of all working age adults are not active enough. So around 50% of all working age adults, 1 in 2 people, are not meeting the guidelines. And it is a pretty lofty aim, 150 minutes. If you think about it, it's about 30 minutes of activity a day. I mean, that's not always easy for a lot of people who have things going on at work or outside of work. Now, if you look at the top right of this screen, we see this other image of make your whole day matter. And Canada's actually was one of the first few countries to take a more holistic approach. And they recognize that physical activity is just really one of a number of different healthy behaviors that we need to be thinking about in order to really get the health benefits of a healthy lifestyle. And so we think about moving more, sitting less, and sleeping well. And if you want to do that, yes, you want to do all of that over a 24-hour day, and they all kind of reciprocate and support each other in kind of in supporting your overall health and well-being. And so in terms of the guidelines, again, they promote this 150 to 300 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity as part of the moving more. And so I have my first question for all of you. And if you can just all log into Slido. I don't see anybody logged in yet, so I'm just going to give a few minutes. But I'd love to know from you, just from my understanding of what it's like for you on your work days. On most days, how active are you at work? And so in your work, I believe most of you would be in some form of care work. I'd love to know just how active are you at work, not in your whole day, but at work. And so if you think about active being, one, you're moving all the time, you're always on your feet, but also it could involve, moderate activity, which is kind of moving sometimes you could be standing for most of the day as well, not necessarily active in the way that we typically associate activity, but you're still active in that you're not sitting. That can also count as moderate activity. Okay, so I'm getting the responses, and hopefully you can all see them as well. And it says that we're not most of us, I guess 40% of the group are not very active, but there's still a sizable representation of people who are also active. So quite active and moderately active, 30%, 30%. So I guess it's what I'd expect. No, the numbers are now all now a third of everybody. We're all kind of split. Which is also, I guess, not surprising. I mean, maybe care work is a bit more diverse. It's not it's completely sedentary, but you're also active in the type of work you do. So that's interesting. And I'm curious to know how this kind of then impacts your activity levels outside of work. So I'm going to maybe now ask you to report again. How active are you outside of work? So try again. And let's see if we still get the same responses. Interesting. Okay. So it seems like we're struggling or challenged to be active at work because of the nature of the work that you do. But you may have more opportunity to be active outside of work in your leisure time, in your recreational time. And that's interesting. And it's really great feedback for me because that's not always the case. And that's not the case for majority of the population, in that it's often very challenging. And often you find that the story is quite similar for at work activity and outside of work activity, and that people are often challenged to find time, and they often reinforce each other. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. And so imagine this, you wake up early, and this might hopefully resonate with some of you. You wake up early and you rush through your morning. You're getting ready for your job, and then on the job, you spend the next 8, 10, maybe 12 hours at work. Now, by the time you get home, you're not just tired, you're drained. And then so the thought of exercising, going for a run, hitting the gym, or even going for a short walk feels like just another task on an already overwhelming list, right? So I find from my own work and speaking to other employees of jobs that this is the reality for many people. And so our working lives aren't just a part of our day. They shape how we feel physically and mentally. And so stressful encounters with people, stressful meetings, tight deadlines, heavy lifting, or just hours on your feet, they all can take a toll. And so if you're working shift work, or if you're balancing more than one job, then just finding time for physical activity starts to feel more like a luxury than a priority. And so, all this, what this figure shows is just that link of how your work can impact your fatigue and your motivation. And then when you're doing other jobs or you're doing other tasks and you're just trying to finish your job, get home and relax or spend time caring for your own family, then it really competes with your ability and choices to engage in physical inactivity, to engage in physical activity. And so the bottom line is that work doesn't end when we clock out of work. It can follow us into our energy levels, our motivation, and our choices about movement. Though it doesn't seem to be the case necessarily for some of you in this very small sample, but I promise you it is the overwhelming case in most people that I've spoken to. And then there's this paradox of movement. And so maybe I've drawn some of you to this talk because of this so-called paradox. Is kind of this interesting title. What is a paradox of movement, you might ask? And it's an emerging area of our understanding around whether physical activity is actually healthy for you. And it may be that physical activity in certain jobs, if it's too high, may actually not be healthy for you. And so imagine spending hours. I have this image of shoveling, and I know it's really, really terrible to bring up shoveling and snow and snowstorms in the summer, but please bear with me. I hopefully there's a purpose to this. This will help explain, I think, at least it helps me understand the paradox. But my apologies for kind of bringing back bad memories. It's very unseasonal. So I'm just going to give you a sense now of the similarities of this so-called paradox with snow shoveling. And so imagine spending hours shoveling snow. You've had a big snowstorm, you wake up and there's a pile of snow you need to get through in order for you to, move the car out of the driveway and go to work. And so you spend hours shoveling. You don't have a snow blower. You have to shovel with a regular snow shovel. And so you're doing things like heavy lifting. You're doing it in awkward angles. Your heart is pumping. You haven't really warmed up doing this type of thing. And you're really focused on trying to get out, kind of get the shoveling done. So you're not really giving yourself any purposeful breaks, right? And imagine doing that every day for years. And so that's what some jobs are like. And I imagine as well, some care jobs are like as well. And so that's what this image, and just imagine, some of the lifting parts of your job, some of the parts where you have to engage with others where, there's a lot of physical demands placed on yourself. And you're not doing it in a way that you would typically be exercising, where you're stretching, you're doing things in a very controlled way, and you're giving yourselves breaks, spacing out your sets, your reps if you are lifting weights. And so in a sense, some jobs are very physically demanding, but they're not done in the same way as exercising, and they're quite strenuous. And this so-called occupational physical activity, which can involve constant lifting, bending, or holding very tense postures, like you're on your knees and you're doing things, you're pushing and pulling. It's not the same as going for a run or hitting the gym. And it's these stresses on the body that don't really build your heart muscle. They don't really build your fitness. But they increase your heart rate, your blood pressure rises, and your inflammation builds. And so, but there's no heart health payoff. And so, you're putting a lot of strain on your body doing these things, but you're not doing things in a very controlled way that really helps build your fitness. And so there's no heart health payoff. And that's what we call this physical activity paradox. And it's associated with a lot of physically demanding jobs and possibly due to care work as well. And you might think that your job is very active, and it probably is, but it's not necessarily if you are doing these activities, not necessarily giving you the same benefits as you would if you were to do exercise in a very controlled way at a gym or going for a run, um, and so forth. And so it's this emerging body of research that we're learning, let's say in the last 10 years, that this type of activity on the job does not provide any health benefits, as we would expect from physical activity. But even in some studies, it might actually be unhealthy, and unhealthy in that it increases your risk due to the strain it puts on your heart and in your health. And so it can either have no risk, because it's not, I mean, it's not the same as exercise, or it has no benefit, but they can also increase your risk if you're doing it strenuously enough. And so, considering that physical activity is hard for a lot of people, it's not always easy to be active if you're very active at work, or if you're tired and you don't have enough motivation to be active outside of work. But then also saying that activity can also be very harmful or not have any benefits if you're in a very physically demanding job. Then what is the right, like, sweet spot? What is the right amount of activity that you need to do for heart health? And so that's what I wanted to find out. I wanted to find out what is that sweet spot for different people. And can we move beyond the guidelines? Do we have to say this general sweeping statement that you have to aim 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity? Or is there like something a bit more doable, more realistic for people that they can aim for? And what is that? And so, again, considering the type of jobs that they do. And so I did a study where I had two objectives. One was to just describe among a national sample of workers, so people representative of all workers in Canada, what their daily activity patterns are like. Like, what are they typically doing in a day? Are there like typical patterns of movement that workers typically do in Canada? And then once we identify these patterns, do any of these patterns provide benefit to your heart health? So are they any of these patterns, are they associated with a lower risk, a future risk of heart disease over a 10-year period? That's the outcome that we looked at in the study. Okay. And so I mentioned we looked at a big national representative sample of people. And so to do that, we worked with data that was already collected by Statistics Canada. And so if you're not familiar with Statistics Canada, they are the ones who run your survey. So they run the census, the long form census that you might have already responded to at some point in your life. And so Statistics Canada runs a whole battery of different surveys that kind of get a sense, along with the census, to get a pulse of what is going on among the Canadian population. And this particular survey that I was interested in was called the Canadian Health Measures Survey. And what was really unique about the Canadian Health Measures Survey is that it has actually three components to it. Beyond just the survey, it has two other components. And so it has this survey component. So it'll come to your house and ask you to complete this battery of questions around, what is your income? How many people live in your house? What is your educational attainment? How many kids do you have? Then also your health. How often do you see a primary care doctor? How often do you go for a walk? How often do you go for a run? How much time do you spend socializing, and questions around mental health, questions around alcohol use and smoking, and you can see that this type of survey can be really useful for getting a sense of not just the demographics of the population, but also getting a sense of the health of a population. And so they sample people, but then they also make sure that they're representative of the population. Now, when I had you do that exercise in the first few minutes of my talk, I had you report how much activity you were doing at work or outside of work. I'm hoping you found it a little challenging to maybe think about how much activity you were doing, because I'm asking you to find an average, or report an average of what you typically do, but that really changes, right? And so asking people to report the amount of physical activity they do or how much time they spend sleeping or engaging in any kind of behavior is challenging. I mean, we're really expected to recall all the details, but we don't always remember them. And we also tend to over-report what we think we're doing. So we tend to think, and if I ask you, how active were you last week? You might want to, give me you might feel a little embarrassed and give me a higher estimate of maybe what you thought, or maybe you might think you did more than you actually did. And so because of that, the quality of this particular survey, one of the qualities is that it actually tracks or got people who participate in the survey to track their movements using an accelerometer. And what an accelerometer is it's a medical grade iWatch or movement tracking device, a Garmin or one of those, those devices which track your movements in the day. You may already have if you have an iWatch, but it's something that you wear on your waist. And it's worn on their waist because it can track your movements on your upper body and your lower body. And what they did is they asked people if they wanted to do this part of the survey, beyond just answering the survey, if they wanted to wear the device, and then they had to wear the device for up to 7 days. So you get a sense of their daily movements over the course of a week. Okay. And so we had that as well. And then what they did was they said, will you also be interested in coming into what we call a mobile examination center, or essentially it's a van with testing equipment. And what they did was they took your blood pressure, they took your heart rate, they actually collected blood samples so they can measure your blood glucose levels, your cholesterol. And so we had this data available to us, again run by Statistics Canada, and we had very detailed clinically assessed measures of health. Okay. And so we have all that information. We have this rich information about who people are, how much movement they've done, and we have clinical measures of their health. And we had this information from 2007 to 2017, so over 10 years. And our sample was about 9,000 workers. And then the next thing is that we wanted to identify their typical movement patterns. And so we had, you can imagine, these accelerometers, these iWatch medical versions of the iWatch, they're collecting a lot of data. They have per minute data on your movement. So what they do is they measure if you're sitting or standing or moving every minute. And so we have a lot of data. That's about what, 14,440 minutes of data in a week. And so with that data, we wanted to do was sift through all that information to identify if there's any typical patterns of movement that workers do. Are there like a typical pattern? Do you have a twin like you who moves like you in a day? And so we used an approach called cluster analysis, which is a statistical method to group things like people, behaviors, or data points in our case, based on how similar they are to each other. And so it helps us find patterns or natural groupings in a large set of information, even if we don't know what we're looking for ahead of time. And so what we do is we just kind of see if there's any kind of patterns that the algorithm can find. And so an example is if we're studying, in this case, people's physical activity habits, cluster analysis can then help us discover if there's one group that tends to exercise more in the morning and then prefers short workouts and prefer doing short workouts spread throughout the day. And if it's maybe a third group that's mostly inactive. And so we can ideally find out those types of that level of granularity, that level of detail in terms of patterns. And so once we have those patterns, we want to see if there's an association with risk of heart disease or a lower risk of heart disease with these different patterns of movement. And so what we did was we looked at each of these patterns and how they were associated with our outcome of a predicted 10-year risk of heart attack or your first heart disease event. And so what we mean by first heart disease event is anything that's a fatal or non-fatal heart attack or coronary heart disease event or stroke over 10 years for people who are free from heart disease at the time when they first joined the study. And so what is your risk of getting a first heart event? And how we assessed that was that, remember those clinical measures that the Canadian Health Measure Survey assessed? Well, with those clinical measures, we have blood pressure, glucose, cholesterol, and other measures. Those measures are typically used by cardiologists and other clinical practitioners to assess your likelihood of getting prescribed a statin, which is a blood thinner to reduce your risk of heart disease. And so what they do is they put your scores in algorithm in an equation, and they can see whether you're at higher risk of getting a future heart attack over the next 10 years, and then it'll inform their prescribing patterns. And so we use that equation as our outcome. We said, okay, if you're at a higher risk, that could be then, I mean, that is a useful outcome for us to assess because we have those clinical measures. Now, I should have also mentioned that this data was only at one point in time. It was cross-sectional. We didn't have access to information that we're able to track people over time to see what their risks were of getting their first heart attack. So instead, we just didn't have the data available to us. So this was really the best way we could predict the first heart event after 10 years. Okay. And so now the interesting stuff, which is what are the profiles and what are the risks for heart disease? And maybe you'll fall into some of these profiles. And I'd love to get your feedback as to which ones you think you fall into. And I'll have another interactive session there as well. So let's start with the first one. So we had 6 profiles. And the first one were the sedentaries. We call them the sedentaries. The sedentaries because they're mostly sitting. And it seemed like a third of you were doing that, mostly sitting on the job and sitting outside of the job as well. And so what this graph shows is just intensity on the y-axis on the left, which is the intensity of activity you're doing in every minute of the day. And then on the x-axis is really a clock of your day. And you'll see that you start from the very early hours of the morning at 1 o'clock in the morning to about 7 in the morning. You're quite inactive. Maybe you're sleeping. So you're not really doing much. So you're sleeping in that time, and then as you start to wake up, there's an increased risk. Not increased risk, sorry. There's more activity, so lighter activity, maybe lower intensity, and then from 7 to 1, you've started to get ready. You've gone to work. Maybe you're driving to work, so you're not very active either. While you're in the office, you're going to your desk, and you're not very active either. And then there's little spikes there of activity. Maybe you've gone for a walk, but not doing a lot of higher intensity activity. And so it's not very brisk walking, but maybe just a casual stroll. And then you're going back and doing some other things that are involving activity. So these are just averages. And then you get home and you're engaging in light activity as well, or quite sedentary activity. And then you're going back, and around 10 o'clock, you're hitting the sack, going to bed. And so this is about, out of our 9,000 people, about 2,808 workers. And we call them the sedentaries. They're probably people in very sedentary jobs. And then they're coming home and maybe their job is very mentally demanding, or they have a lot of things that they have going on in their lives, or they just aren't motivated. And so they're not doing a lot of activity at home. And so what we did was we identified 6 profiles. And because this profile, we thought they're not really getting the benefits that come from movement, because they're really not moving much. We call this our comparison group. So we compared all other profiles with this group to see what is the risk or the benefit of moving more than this group for future heart disease risk. So the next group are our steady movers. And so these are people who are maybe constantly on their feet or on the move throughout the day, doing light or moderate activity. And so these are more than the sedentary workers. There's about 3,200 workers in our sample. And you can see again, from 1 to 7, as you'd expect, they'd be sleeping, maybe working in a daytime schedule. And then as they're starting to get through their day, they actually have a higher intensity of movement than the more sedentaries. Then, they generally have a higher, say this is mid-level in our graph, a kind of moderate level of activity, but they're constantly moving or they're on their feet. So I think of this maybe as maybe your person working with clients, with maybe a care worker working with people, constantly being on their feet. Or maybe this is also a person in service and sales sector as well, dealing with people. But then as they kind of get home and they aren't working so much they're not working anymore, their activity levels tend to decrease as well. So most of the activity seems to be coming from their job. There's a little bit outside of work, but it seems to be coming mostly from their work. Now, just for moving more than the sedentary group, this group is at 14% lower risk of future heart disease. Okay, 14% lower risk, and so that's substantial. Now, the next group are what we call the dynamic movers. So this is not as many as the other two groups. So 1,194 workers from the 9,000. We think of maybe our healthcare workers, um, many of them, and maybe even care workers, where you're doing a lot of switching between lower intensity to moderate intensity activity throughout the day. And so you're rushing to something, you're dealing, putting out fires and moving around constantly. Um, but it's this group, because they're moving more than the other two groups and moving more than the last group, they are actually at even lower risk for future heart disease of 27%. And then you have an interesting group here, the night shifters. And so I'm not sure how many of you have worked night shifts, work shifts, but shift work in itself is a really interesting group because shift work, you're essentially you're by doing work at the opposite side of the day, as most of the population are doing daytime work, you're changing your biological clock. And so we have evidence that by switching the biological clock, you impact your sleep quality. It makes it very hard for you to kind of um, you might want to cope with the poor sleep and less sleep by coping with unhealthy eating or other what we associate with poorer lifestyle habits. And so we generally associate night shift work with a higher risk for heart disease. But what's really interesting in this group, which was also the smallest group, 225 workers, was that in this particular sample, they were actually quite active. You can see that they're active um, throughout the early morning, and then they're active quite later on in the evening. And so these could be your warehouse workers, maybe even healthcare workers. But something about that activity in this particular group might be contributing to this lower risk of that comes with this group, which is also kind of counter to what we typically think of shift workers because of the other things that you deal with, the poor diet, the other lifestyle behaviors, and then there's disruptive circadian rhythms that can increase our risk for inflammation, which we all think can lead to an increased risk for heart disease. But in our particular study, we find that they're also active in this particular sample, which might be contributing to a 30%, 33% lower risk. And then there's a fifth group, the exercisers. So this is like the model worker, the ones that we think are just like they get it. They're the ones who meet the guidelines, maybe have no trouble meeting the guidelines. They're very active. Their job also may allow them to be active. And so this is not a sizable group, 750 workers out of the 9,000. And they're working in the daytime. So they start up early in their morning, so around 4:30 or 5. They start their day, maybe take the dog for a walk, start getting more active. Then maybe they commute actively to work. But then they have little dips here and there. Maybe they have opportunities or facilities that are supportive of being active on the job. But then as their day unwinds, or as they get home and they're unwinding, they are less active. But they've already accumulated a lot of activity throughout the day. And this group has the lowest risk compared to the most sedentary group of future heart disease, 42%, as you would expect. As I said, if you increase your levels of physical activity, if you meet the guidelines, you stand to get all those benefits that come from being active. Okay, so no surprise there. Now, there is a sixth group, and this group is what we think is our paradox group. And it's this paradox. And so the reason I think that is that there's this group here, which is similar numbers to the exercise group, but they're mostly active in the daytime over daytime work hours. But again, their activity unwinds as they get home. But they're in generally, when we kind of just wanted to understand what type of jobs they did, they're in very physically demanding jobs. And it's something about those physically demanding jobs. They're not doing exercise or not doing physical activity in the same way that the most active workers are. And so they might be doing a lot of that lifting, pushing, pulling, maybe standing a lot in their job. It might resonate with some of you in your jobs. And so they're being quite active, but active in a way that introduces strain on their body. And so we thought, okay, let's look at this group. And we find that there's actually no difference or no difference to the sedentary group in terms of their risk. So that's not saying that there's no benefit or no risk, but that there's there's no difference of this group to the most sedentary group in terms of the risk for heart disease. So they're actually quite similar to the most sedentary group. So even being active in the most physically demanding jobs may not be contributing to the benefits that we typically associate with physical activity. Okay, so then recommendations. What can we do about it? And where do you fall into? So I thought this is really important, but I have to also say that this is really based on my understanding of some of the interventions out there that this study didn't really tackle. But I'm also aware that these findings, these recommendations may not work for you, and I'd love to get your feedback about what you think would actually work for you. And so one recommendation is if you find yourself in the very like not very active groups, so like the sedentaries or the steady movers who are not doing a lot of activity, what you want to do is try to move more. Try to move more as much as you can because something is better than nothing. And what can help? Well, try to think about some of the barriers that make it hard for you to move. What can or who can help you address them? If you have access to facilities or if you need access to facilities, what can allow you to have that access? Can your employer give you opportunities to get access or memberships to a gym or access to breaks to make time or have breaks to make time for yourself, or flexi time to engage in physical activity, and also learn from people who are successful, and see what works for them might work for you. Second recommendation is if you're in a very physically demanding job, and if your job, say you do fall into that group that you're working a lot with, you're doing a lot of heavy lifting of people or pushing or pulling, then think about this as a strain, and think about ways in which you can set yourself up to deal with that strain. So one is to warm up before demanding tasks, like you would maybe hopefully warm up before you go out and shovel snow. Take breaks. So try to replicate physically demanding work with what you would do if you were at the gym. Take short breaks and allow yourself to take time to recover. So allow your heart rate to kind of recover because you're really doing things at a very high intensity, without giving yourself the ability to withstand those shocks and those strains. And if you can, try to make time to also exercise after work because that physically demanding work may not be giving you the benefits that you think it may, previously. And what can you do to help? Well, practice the precautionary principle. And if you don't know what that is, it's really be better safe than sorry. Be safe than sorry. Think that, you need to giving yourself a chance to warm up, take breaks, all of these things at least gives you a chance to, if there is a risk of physically demanding work on your health, give yourself a chance to alleviate those risks or lessen those risks. And if you have access to policies, or if there's an opportunity to hopefully inform policy or your organization, it'd be about creating a supportive culture or policies that are supportive of taking rest after physical exertion, warming up, making sure that these can be normative rather than being awkward and something that's weird on the job. And then if you're already active, well, keep doing what you're doing and try to help others who may be struggling or may not know how to do it and share those best practices, and see ways in which you can share those practices towards your colleagues, and make them feel supported as well. And so now I want to learn from you. And so I've shared these recommendations to different workforces, and I hope that some of these maybe resonate with you in care work. But I'd love to know whether these are practical for you. And so I've shared a link here. If you could just log in, once you get into your Slido, it'll just ask you to put into a text box whether these practical recommendations are practical for you. And so I'd love to know if they are or not, and if you have any feedback. I'm just going to leave it open for a few minutes. Sorry. So I see one participant so far. I'd love to see more of you. Do they make sense? Do they seem like something you can actually incorporate in your day? If there's other things I need to be thinking about. And really, this is for my own knowledge, just to understand if there's anything I'm missing. And I'd love for this to potentially be a stepping stone for more targeted guidance for care workers. And I'm saying this because our work was really broad in that it captured all workers. But I would love to know if these recommendations work for you. And so it's possible. Looks like it's healthy, can be active. I mean, curious to know if this word cloud actually works, but I'm seeing very positive things. Just give a few more minutes to hear from you. Hey, just give a few more minutes. Okay, so it seems like everyone has taken something from this talk. I was curious to know how much information I can get from a word cloud, but it seems like these are all positive things. And hopefully these recommendations speak to you. And I really hope that the recommendations can be doable, but also recognizing that some of the main takeaways are that there's no real simple solution for everybody. We're not all robots. We don't all have the same activity habits, but when we were trying to typologize, kind of come up with patterns of activity for workers, we did identify six, and maybe some of them resonate with you. But then they're saying that, there's also something to be said that the guidance, these catch-all 150 minutes may not work for you, and they may be alternative strategies. And what we found from our work is that, something is better than nothing. Moving is beneficial. And so even if you can't meet the guidelines, try to move as much as you can, especially if you're sitting a lot. And try to move. If you can't find time to move at work, try to find time to move outside of work. But if you find that your work is involving a lot of pushing, pulling, heavy lifting, awkward positions, standing, that can actually not give you the health benefits that we might be thinking it does. And we need to be thinking about ways in which we might want to modify our work to allow us to come up with ways in which we can warm up before heavy lifting, before putting strain on our body and allowing us to cool down a little bit. And all of these things can allow us to be more resistant, more resilient to the health effects that come from this physically demanding work or this paradox. And ultimately, though, if we can create a culture of work where we learn from those who are successful, or allow we create policies which allow us to feel comfortable in making time to be active, making time to warm up, making time to cool down, I think all of this will enable more of us to engage in the benefits that come from physical activity. So that's all I have for today. I have shared a link to a more lay-friendly summary of the broader paper. It's been published in a peer-reviewed journal in the American Heart Association's journal. That said, if I have 10 minutes to answer questions, but if there's anything that I don't get to, or I haven't answered, or I haven't thought of yet, or it comes to you later, please feel free to reach out to me via email. And I'd be very much happy to answer your questions. So thank you very much.
Yeah, so if you have any questions for Avi, please feel free to put them in the chat now. I see someone has put a comment to keep themselves active. They choose to cycle to work and take the stairs instead of using the elevator. So it's all about those, little choices you make through the day uh, that increases that.
I think that's
Uh,
fantastic. Finding ways
yeah,
to be active in your day. If it's even if it's a little harder, it makes your day a little longer. Maybe it makes you a little more tired, but
for sure.
it's part of it.
I see someone has asked a question. So they asked, sharp change of shifts at night to morning are most likely to have a heart effect. Like what happened to my friend? How do you solve this? I'm not
Hmm.
sure exactly
I
what
think
that
that might
means.
mean how do
Eh,
you balance this?
Oh, balances. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So that's yeah. That's something I'm looking at. I'm hoping to kind of explore further, just shift work and the effects of that. And I'm sorry to hear about your friend. And I hope that they're doing okay. I think that really based on just it's about balance is one thing. There's some evidence that shift work, there's a lot of different factors. It's shift work's almost like a perfect storm. It's like it's necessary, you have to do it, but it also, impacts your biological clock, it impacts your other behaviors. So there's some evidence that actually physical activity can improve your capability, some of these effects that come from shift work by allowing you to sleep better, and allowing you to kind of actually balance your circadian rhythm a bit more. But again, the challenge is finding time to do it. So it's about being creative and finding time to make time to engage in activity if you're doing shifts.
I see Carmel has asked, can you speak to short bursts of exercise so that can accumulate more minutes of exercise in the day? Any examples you can offer?
Yeah, so short bursts of exercise, I think ideally something is better than nothing. So if you can incorporate any kind of exercise, if it's short bursts, I think it's all great. If it's better than what you did before, it all adds up. And ideally, if you're able to, if you're doing it for less time than other, if you, I guess less overall activity in a day, but if you're doing short bursts, try to do it at a higher intensity. If you can, that adds more benefit. So if you're doing a higher intensity in short bursts, that's sometimes just as good as doing very low for longer duration. So if you're trying to do that, and what might that include? So think about going for a brisk walk. If you're on the treadmill, move your setting to a little higher, and make it on an incline. And so you're doing things at a higher intensity than you're doing. You're working harder, you're sweating more, you're finding harder to form sentences, then you know that you're doing it right.
Awesome. Someone asked, they said they are active, but they find it difficult to find shoes that don't hurt. I don't know if you could speak on that. I know that there are some businesses that make personalized shoes to your feet, but here's on your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, having the right shoe, if it helps you walk more, I think that's really need to figure that out. And I think one way that I've learned is getting if you have if you're able to get a prescription to see a podiatrist or get prescriptions for insoles or the right shoes that are really fit to your feet, that's ideal. But if you aren't able to, then getting good running shoes that have good arch support that allow you to walk for long distances without pain, I think that is the best. It's not, I'm really speaking out of my wheelhouse here, but I really think that if that's what's holding you back, I think if you can address that, that would be great.